Okay, guys, we're going to quickly kind of touch on landforms. Landforms, although I know we kind of all reconcile this with geography of this rote memorization of landforms, and while I do want you to understand what they are, at the same time, I don't want to spend too much time on them. So I really want to think of this as a review. I know you guys have kind of gone over landforms in previous courses that you've had throughout your scholastic career, and so I don't really want to hammer this in or spend too much time on it in class necessarily. That being said, I do want you to understand what they are, and you also need to be able to understand in what context you have to be able to recognize landforms when solving geographical problems. So while I'm not going to just tell you you have to memorize every single thing in this presentation, at the same time, I do want to tell you that I want you to be prepared to have an understanding of it, and I want you to be prepared to see it either on some quizzes or on the CBAs. Okay, so we have kind of this little map that you can look at and kind of get a good idea of what kind of makes up these different types of landforms. A lot of these in our common conversation, we use these extremely interchangeably, some of them. A harbor or a gulf, I mean, but they are different and there are specific differences to them. We have an island, which you should be familiar with. Some examples here. A strait is a narrow channel connecting two larger bodies of water. This is the Strait of Gibraltar that connects the Mediterranean Sea in this little area they also call the Alboran Sea with the larger Atlantic Ocean. A delta, such as the Mississippi Delta or the Nile Delta. Here's a delta here. A plateau, a broad flat area of land higher than the surrounding land. Can also be called a mesa, but these are used to often describe a more smaller plateau. Tectonic plates and boundaries, I want you to be somewhat familiar with these. These are under the Earth's surface, and it's these tectonic plates that are constantly moving around that help to form the current shape of the continents as we see them. Make no mistake, they will not be this shape forever, and they are always constantly moving, which is why we have earthquakes and also how we get mountains. And these tectonic plates and how they move helps to form some of the landforms that we need to recognize. The Rocky Mountains and the Appalachian Mountains, any Appalachian mountain range is going to be formed by a convergent boundary. That's these tectonic plates that are coming together. And you can see these are the major mountain ranges. They're not the only mountain ranges in existence, but they are major mountain ranges. The Appalachian Mountains are actually much older than the Rocky Mountains. We know this because, as you can see, the Appalachian Mountains are smaller. Well, the smaller, more rounded off mountains that have more vegetation on them are actually going to be a lot older because once they have surfaced from these convergent boundaries, this is the result of thousands of years of erosion and weathering from the world around it. Whereas if you look at the Rocky Mountains, they still have a more jagged appearance. Despite being also in the thousands of years old, they formed later, and so they are actually younger. Eventually, maybe way after we're gone, the Rocky Mountains will look more familiar to the Appalachian Mountains. A peninsula you should be somewhat familiar with, such as the almost the entirety of the state of Florida is one big peninsula. surrounded on water by three sides and juts out into a body of water. A coral reef, and there are different types, such as atolls or barrier reefs or fringing reefs. Here's an atoll. And as you can see, it kind of makes a more circular structure, and we call those smaller areas lagoons of water. A floodplain. It is a more sunken area around bodies of water where these areas are easily flooded, and then we typically see a more raised structure around it called levees. Now, some levees have formed naturally, but more often what we're going to hear is when we talk about levees is these are going to be man-made. Okay, you don't necessarily call a natural levee a levee because it was just naturally formed, but levees tend to be associated with man-made raised structures of earth, or even sometimes concrete, such as the levees around New Orleans. Remember when these levees broke back in, you may not remember, but back in 2005, the levees broke in New Orleans, flooding the city because it was located on a floodplain. A gulf and a bay are oftentimes, can sometimes, I've heard them used interchangeably, but they are different. A gulf is water surrounded by land on three sides, kind of like the peninsula of water in a sense. But a bay is a large body of water connected to an ocean or sea. A gulf also can be connected to an ocean or sea, but it's formed by an inlet of water due to the surrounding land blocking some of the waves and often reducing the wind. So if you go and look at, say, Galveston Bay, it's going to look much, much different in Galveston Bay than if you went to the actual beach at Galveston looking directly into the Gulf of Mexico. There's not going to be as much wind. There's not going to be a lot of waves in the bay. It's going to be almost like a small saltwater lake, but there is inlets out to where the Gulf actually is. We also have a cape. So you guys should be familiar with the water cycle, fancily termed here as the hydrologic cycle. I assume I'm pronouncing that correctly, but who knows? We obviously have water that evaporates from major bodies of water such as lakes, gulfs, oceans, ponds, whatever, into the atmosphere, turns into water vapor. These are where, as it cools, it turns back into rain or snow or condensation that falls from the clouds, soaks back into the ground, and begins the cycle all over again. Maybe taking some sort of a side detour to be drank for a while by an animal, but it gets recycled obviously through your body as well, or the animal's body as well, and eventually the majority of it tends to end up right back where it started in the water cycle. 70% of our bodies are obviously made of water, but we're just borrowing it. When we die, it goes right back into the water cycle. We also have some surface runoff or groundwater as it sinks into the soil, and this can eventually make its way back in to the ocean sometimes, not always, but back into the oceans. We have aquifers, which are large underground, vast underground storages of water, which we are constantly using. A lot of the water that we use within the United States comes from major aquifers. But these are limited aquifers in the sense that they don't really refill very fast. This is a long process. And so once we kind of get that groundwater out or from these aquifers, if we consume faster than it can refill up from the rain and precipitation that's sinking back down into the soil, then we will run out of that water source, which is something that has been increasingly on the minds of people looking at water conservation, especially people up in, say, the Panhandle of Texas or the Great Plains, where all the agriculture is. Kind of see a better representation of groundwater here and kind of how that works a little bit. Some of it obviously comes from the river or the lake. It only goes so deep, though, because as we go deeper into the layer of the Earth's crust, there is rock that it will not be able to penetrate. Groundwater, we can also call this the water table. Okay, and it isn't constant. This even we think of the this water. If it's in an aquifer, it's kind of there, but if it's groundwater, it's kind of in between. It hasn't really settled into an aquifer yet. It's just kind of sitting there in the soil, and the amount of water that's in there isn't constant, especially as we use it. And as you can see here, it gives a lot of different areas. If you look at the time of the year, the water table is going to rise as we get more rainfall. And if we have, say, a real dry season or a summer that doesn't get much rain, that water table is going to falter a little bit. And as you can see, there are some areas where the spout's able to reach that water, and then other times where it's not able to reach it at all. And so we constantly are having water conservationists look at this so that we can really regulate how much water we're using. So what I want you to do is, if you have access to your textbook online, or are you able to come into class and look at a textbook there, or if you're able to look online using your phone or your tablet, although not a phone in my class, hopefully, is that I want you to look up Senegal. All right. Senegal, it's just this random area in Africa, okay? But it's something that you will probably see questions on, and on your CBA. Senegal is one of these countries that is used as an example that the state wants you guys to know, so they may test you on it. I want you to kind of look at Senegal, and I want you to identify the landforms that you can see. I want you to kind of draw a landform map of Senegal, and take about 5 minutes to do this. And think about the different elements from there that you could use. Okay. I want you to kind of think in terms, if we're looking at the 5 themes of geography, I want you to think of place. Okay. What about the landforms in Senegal is significant? How is that going to affect how you're going to live? How is that going to affect what you're going to be able to use in your lifestyle? Okay. So I want you guys to draw that up. Okay. It doesn't have to be a pretty Picasso picture. Okay. But I want you to kind of do that and kind of use that to critically think about Senegal in and of itself. Kind of read a little bit about it, what type of place Senegal is. And I want you to turn that into me next class period. Okay, guys. And once you've done that, I want you to be able to watch this video here. Hopefully it works. If it doesn't, let me know and I'll take it down. But it should work. It worked for me last time I checked. So, and it kind of talks a little bit about an example of landforms to kind of give you a better understanding. And we will talk further on this next class period.